Imagine a place where the future didn't just happen. It was manufactured. In 1979, this spot on the map was a swamp. It was just a collection of tiny fishing huts and muddy rice paddies. 30,000 people lived here then, barely surviving on the edge of the world. Fast forward to today, it is the hardware capital of the entire planet. Home to 17 million people and the world's fastest growing skyline. They call it the Shenzhen speed. At one point, they were adding a new skyscraper floor every 3 days. While the rest of the world debated policy, Shenzhen was moving dirt. But this wasn't an urban planning accident. It was a high-stakes, billion-dollar geopolitical heist. A national classroom for a country desperate to rewrite its own DNA. The man who started it all had a secret weapon. He called it a special economic zone. To the locals, it was an experiment. To the West, it looked like a miracle. But the real gears behind this city's rise are much more calculated. And it all started with a single, dangerous line on a map. In 1979, the world didn't know about a place called Bao'an County. Most maps just showed it as a quiet patch of green north of Hong Kong. It was a landscape of muddy rice paddies and salt-crusted fishing nets. Only 30,000 people lived here then. They survived on a total annual GDP of just 196 million RMB. That is roughly $126 million for the entire region. Across the Shamchun River, the contrast was terrifying. Hong Kong was already a neon-lit financial beast. The British territory had soaring skyscrapers and massive container ports. Meanwhile, Bao'an was so poor that people regularly tried to swim across the border. They were desperate for any chance at a better life in the City of Light. But geography is destiny. Beijing realized that this swampy border was the only logical gateway to the West. If they wanted to open China, they had to start right here. They needed to turn the backyard of Hong Kong into a front door for the world. This wasn't just about building houses or fixing roads. It was about carving out a space where the old rules simply didn't apply. And that meant making a choice that most communists at the time found unthinkable. The man who started it all, Deng Xiaoping, wasn't a dreamer. He was a pragmatist running a high-stakes gamble. He knew he couldn't flip the switch for 1 billion people at once, so he carved out a tiny circle on the map. He called it a special economic zone. It was essentially a legal shadow zone. Foreigners were invited in with massive tax breaks and low-cost labor. But there was one major problem. The new city was starving for infrastructure. The government owned every inch of dirt but had zero cash in the bank. In 1987, they pulled off the ultimate economic pivot. They realized they could sell the usage without losing the ownership. It was a clever hack of communist law. On December 1st, they held a public auction. They sold a 50-year residential lease for 5.25 million Chinese yuan. That was about $1.4 million back then. This land finance was the secret gear. It gave Shenzhen the money to build roads, power, and ports instantly. With the cash secured, the city didn't just grow. It exploded into a building frenzy that would soon break every record in history. By the early 1980s, the fever had officially set in. Shenzhen was no longer just a patch of dirt. It was a construction site that never went to sleep. This was the era of the Dagongmei building. It stood 160 meters tall. At the time, it was the tallest building in all of China. But the height wasn't the headline. The headline was how fast it rose. Workers were adding a new floor every 3 days. They called it Shenzhen speed. It became a national obsession. But look beneath the concrete and you find the real engine. The 3+1 manufacturing model was the secret gear. companies brought in raw materials and designs from the West. Shenzhen provided the land and the hands to put them together. This is where the Dagongmei entered the story. These were the migrant sisters from the rural interior. Most were between 16 and 25 years old. They were escaping arranged marriages and dead-end farm life. In the 80s, these women made up 40% of the entire workforce. Many used borrowed IDs just to get through the factory gates. They lived in cramped dormitories and worked 12-hour shifts. They were the ones assembling the world's toys and early circuit boards. Their hands were the first to touch the future of global tech. But as the factories churned out millions of products, something began to overflow. The massive scale of the 80s factories created a side effect. They needed a place where the logic of the factory met the chaos of the street. And that place was about to become the most important square mile on Earth. By the 1990s, Huaqiangbei had become a high-tech labyrinth. It is several square kilometers of pure electrical noise. To a stranger, it looks like total chaos. The district is packed with massive skyscrapers. Inside, thousands of tiny stalls are jammed together. Each booth is no bigger than a walk-in closet, but these closets hold every component ever made. You can buy a specific microchip for a single cent. You can find a high-resolution screen for $1. In Silicon Valley, a designer waits a week for shipping. In Huaqiangbei, you just walk across the hall. This physical density is the secret gear of the city. It creates a feedback loop that never stops. Western companies used to laugh at this place. They called it Shanzai or copycat culture. They saw it as a den of thieves and fakes. But for Shenzhen, it was a massive, unorganized university. Small workshops would tear apart a famous smartphone. They would study every single trace on the circuit board. They weren't just copying a product, they were learning the language of hardware. They even invented features that global brands missed, like the dual SIM phone for migrant workers. This was a grassroots open-source hardware ecosystem. It trained an army of engineers for the next phase. The copycats were about to become the masters. The 2000s saw the rise of the national champions. The city was moving from cheap toys to world-class tech. This was the follow-up innovation phase. A former military engineer named Ren Zhengfei started Huawei. He launched it in 1987 with only 21,000 RMB. That was about $5,000 at the time. Ren brought a wolf culture to the corporate world. It was a mindset of absolute aggression and survival. He poured every cent back into research and development. He knew that copying foreign tech would only get them so far. Meanwhile, another visionary named Pony Ma was watching. He founded Tencent in 1998 in a small Shenzhen office. He started with a simple instant messaging tool called QQ, but he eventually built WeChat, the ultimate digital ecosystem. It became a Swiss Army knife for daily life. You could pay taxes, book a doctor, or buy lunch. All of this happened without ever touching physical cash. These giants succeeded because they sat on a supply chain throne. They weren't just writing code in a vacuum, they were surrounded by thousands of specialized suppliers. Shenzhen could prototype a device in 24 hours. The city began filing more international patents than any other Chinese city. They reached 110 high-value patents per 10,000 people. That is nearly 8 times the national average. The fishing village was now a global tech hegemon. They were finally standing eye to eye with Silicon Valley. But success on this scale breeds massive geopolitical friction, and the city was about to hit a high-tech brick wall. In 2019, the high-speed growth of Shenzhen hit a massive brick wall. The United States added Huawei to its trade entity list. For most tech companies, this was a death sentence. It meant they could no longer buy vital American chips or software. But the pressure only got more intense as the years went by. By 2025, the US introduced what analysts call the shotgun rule. It expanded the blast radius of the trade blacklist. If a blacklisted firm owned half of another company, that company was banned too. The list of forbidden entities surged from 1,300 to over 20,000. The goal was to suffocate the city's high-tech heart. But Shenzhen didn't just roll over and die. Its engineers entered a state of total mobilization. This was the mechanism of technological self-sufficiency. Huawei launched a desperate mission to scrub American tech from its hardware. They replaced over 13,000 foreign components with local Chinese parts. Their teams had to redesign 4,000 circuit boards from the ground up. This wasn't just a corporate update. It was a massive, city-wide struggle for survival. Instead of collapsing, the city became more independent. By 2024, Huawei actually increased its global market share to 34%. The sanctions acted like a harsh, evolutionary pressure. They forced Shenzhen to stop refining Western tools and start building its own. The national champions had successfully built a parallel digital world. And as they looked toward 2026, they weren't just surviving. They were preparing to lead the next revolution in the sky. By 2026, the skyline of Shenzhen is no longer just about height. It is about the invisible logic that keeps the city breathing. The government has declared a new mission for the next decade. They call it the low-altitude economy. In most cities, drones are just hobbyist toys. In Shenzhen, they are the blood of the logistics network. The city is building a drone-based infrastructure for medical delivery and survey checks. But the intelligence isn't just in the sky. Shenzhen is pivoting toward embodied AI and advanced robotics. They are targeting a 100 billion yuan robotics industry by 2027. Even the city's bones are being re-engineered for the climate crisis. It has become a sponge city. Buildings like the Tencent Binhai mansion use cloud-controlled sensors to manage rainwater. They recycle 400,000 cubic meters of water every single year. This sustains local wetlands while the city keeps expanding. The fishing village that Deng Xiaoping imagined is now a mighty tree. It proved that you don't need a 1,000-year plan to change history. You just need a single, flexible line on a map. The height of your starting point doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how fast you can build.